In the name of God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Amen. It's been reported that over 10,000 Victorians have refused to participate in COVID-19 testing. Now, there are a number of reasons why this may be. It may be a certain fear of being forced into quarantine, then not being able to go to work, and a fear of a loss of employment. It may be a fear of the discomfort of actually having the thing stuck up your nose. It may be some misunderstanding through language barriers and all sorts of reasons why people might refuse this kind of testing. I've even heard that there's a widespread belief that COVID-19 is actually a government conspiracy, and so people don't want to enter into that. There's also a well-publicised video, one that we couldn't actually show in church, of this Broadmeadows resident taking the libertarian line of exercising his right of freedom of movement when it came to the lockdown of his particular suburb. Now, if you're wondering why the United States of America is leading the world in coronavirus infections and then, of course, in coronavirus deaths, it's not so much just the appallingly inept leadership, although that's certainly the case. It's not even so much the devastatingly inadequate public health system, although that is also contributing, of course, to the number of deaths. To find the cause of such dreadful outcomes, you need to look no further than libertarianism in all its various manifestations. Libertarianism is a political philosophy and movement that upholds liberty and individual freedom as a core principle, as an absolute principle. Now, we've seen this in America manifest itself in the large groups coming together and refusing to wear masks or to physically distance. 4th of July celebration this weekend, a big gathering at Mount Rushmore, and one of the president's spokesperson said, "We will not be social distancing." It's part of a political philosophy. It's also a philosophy that is applied to gun ownership, which results in 30,000 deaths per year in the United States. As Jesus says, wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. Or perhaps to put that concept into the vernacular, we could use the words of the great philosopher Forrest Gump, who says, "Mama says, stupid is as stupid does." Sadly, occasionally, we see this philosophy sneaking into our own national conversation. Now, of course, there is nothing wrong with liberty. I'm all for liberty. And there is nothing wrong with individual freedoms. I'm all for individual freedoms. In themselves, they are all good things. Just ask the people of Hong Kong at the moment whether they think liberty and individual freedoms are good things. It does, however, depend on how those individual freedoms relate to other individuals. Jesus says, "Come to me all who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, this is one of those Bible verses that is so well known. We probably learned it in Sunday school off by heart. We may well have learnt it in the old King James Version. "Come to me all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." We know it so well. And when we have a Bible verse that we know so well, that is so much a part of the psyche of collective Christianity, Bible translators are often reluctant to move away from that 1611 translation. And of course, words in those days meant things that can be slightly different to what they mean today. The Greek word that we translate as easy is Christos, Chrestos, Christos. And incidentally, there's only one letter different in that word from Christos, Christos, which we translate as Christ. But it's not Christos, as in Christ, it's Christos. And we translate it in this particular text as easy. My yoke is easy, my yoke is Christos, and my burden is light. But this word is translated everywhere else in the New Testament as either kind or good. A yoke that was Christos, a yoke that was kind, was in fact kind on the animal that bore it. So its edges were well rounded and smooth, and it was well shaped for the animal that it was over. So it made the carrying of the burden easier or kinder. Of course, if a yoke has rough, sharp edges, it'll rub through the skin of the oxen or horse or whatever's carrying it. But if it's a Christos yoke, then it is kind and doesn't harm the animal in that way. It is not painful for the animal to bear the load. So Christos we translate as easy, better as perhaps kind or good, is distinguished from the other word in the New Testament which we'd also translate as good, and that word is agathos. Wherever we come across agathos, it's normally translated as good. Now, agathos means the good. It's an ideal kind of good, in a very formal sense. That big picture, we say that is good. That's agathos. While Christos is always relational in nature. So it's good compared to another kind of good. It's good compared to what's going on for both me compared to you. So you have agathos, which is the formal sense of good, and Christos, which is the relational sense of good. So in this context, my yoke is Christos, my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus' yoke does not represent sort of an ideal good, but a good in relation to other yokes that you might put on. So what Jesus is recognising is that there are different kinds of yokes, and of course that was what it was like for rabbis. People would take on the yoke of the rabbi. Now in this context, the choices we make regarding our behaviours around coronavirus, we can say that liberty and personal freedom is agathos. It is good. It is something to be desired in that formal sense of how we understand good. While choosing to hand sanitise and physical distance and self-isolate where we're unwell and get tested when we're symptomatic or contact positive with someone who is symptomatic, we could call that Christos. We could call that kind. We could call that good, because it's a good that is in relationship with other people around us. It is a relational burden, a relational yoke that we choose to carry for the good of others and for our own good. In first century Judaism, it was common for a disciple to take on the yoke of their rabbi. Now, this meant that it was about living in the same way as that particular rabbi, doing what that rabbi did. Take my yoke upon you. That's what rabbis said to their disciples. And learn from me. For my yoke is a particular kind of yoke in relation to other yokes. My yoke is Christos. My yoke is kind. Now that's, if you remember that story of the disciples out in the boat and Jesus walking towards the boat on the water and Peter jumps out of the boat and tries to walk on the water. Well, that's just Peter taking on the yoke of his rabbi. He is just doing what his rabbi is doing. His rabbi is walking on the water, so, well, that's what I've got to do too, because that's what I do. My rabbi does that, so I do that. That's Peter simply taking on the yoke, doing what Jesus did. I've often spoke of the two main rabbinic traditions of Jesus' time, that of Rabbi Shammai and that of Rabbi Hillel. Now, Rabbi Shammai and Rabbi Hillel agreed on the one big thing, the first great commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. They said, yes, that's it. That's the greatest and first commandment. But they differed on what the second commandment was, the second greatest commandment. Rabbi Shammai said that the second great commandment is you shall be holy. You shall keep yourself pure and undefiled from the world. But Rabbi Hillel said the second great commandment was that you shall love your neighbour as yourself. Now, those two second great commandments only ever came into conflict when you were drawn to understand that your neighbour was everyone. Your neighbour was every other human being and perhaps every other sentient being, as opposed to just an observant Jew. That's where we get that question that results in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Who is my neighbour? It's the question of the day that everybody would ask when they were working out which yoke they were going to take on, whether they were going to take on the yoke of the school of purity and holiness, or the yoke of loving your neighbour. The yoke of Rabbi Shammai was the yoke of the law. I will do what my rabbi did. I will observe the law. I will keep the 613 rules and regulations and commandments. That's the yoke. The yoke of Rabbi Hillel was I will love my neighbour as myself. If we are disciples of Jesus, yoke bearers of Jesus, then we too are called to take upon ourselves the yoke of Christos, and the yoke of Christos, by the way, but the yoke of Christos, the yoke of kindness, the yoke that is relational with our neighbours, one with the other, the yoke that values the freedom and well-being of others as well as our own freedom and well-being. The yoke that loves our neighbours as ourselves. If Jesus is our rabbi, if we are his yoke bearers, take upon you my yoke, for my yoke is kindness and my burden is light. If Jesus is our rabbi, if we are his disciples, then we will choose to behave in a way that is in the other's best interests. So we will hand sanitize, and we will physically distance. We will self-isolate when we are unwell. We will get tested when we are symptomatic or we've been in contact with someone else who is symptomatic. We will stay in our suburbs and our houses if we're advised to do so. Even if this sounds burdensome, and it is. Ask those poor people now locked in their flats in Melbourne. It's incredibly... I can't imagine. At least I had a yard to run around in, and I've now got 2 chooks and all sorts of wonderful things. Imagine if you're just locked in a little flat. It's incredibly burdensome. No wonder people are afraid to get tested. Even if it's even if it just sounds ridiculous that we've got to do this, but we do it because we bear the yoke of kindness, We bear the yoke that is relational. We bear the yoke that considers the other. The yoke that has regard for the well-being of others, especially the well-being of the vulnerable, because we regard their well-being as equal in value to our well-being. Come unto me, all who labour and are heavy laden, for I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly of heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is kindness, and therefore my burden is light. The Lord be with you.